On October 22nd, 2024, baseball lost one of its most beloved figures when Fernando Valenzuela passed away at age 63. But his death marked the end of a life that was anything but tragic. This was a man who rose from the humblest beginnings to become a cultural phenomenon that changed baseball forever. Fernando Valenzuela's story begins in Echohuaquila, a tiny farming town in Sonora, Mexico. Born November 1st, 1960, he was the youngest of 12 children in a poor family of Mayo indigenous ancestry. His parents worked the land, struggling to make ends meet. Baseball wasn't even on the radar for most kids in his situation, yet Fernando would somehow journey from these dusty fields to the bright lights of Los Angeles, becoming the most unlikely superstar the sport had ever seen. His path to greatness started by pure accident. In 1979, legendary Dodgers scout Mike Brito was sent to Mexico to evaluate a shortstop prospect named Ali Usconga. But when 17-year-old Fernando struck out Usconga on 3 straight pitches, Brito completely forgot about the shortstop. That moment changed everything. The Dodgers purchased Fernando's contract for just $120,000, a bargain that would pay dividends beyond imagination. The young pitcher arrived in the Dodgers minor league system with raw talent but lacking the velocity scouts typically looked for in top prospects. Rather than give up on him, the organization made a brilliant decision. They had fellow pitcher Bobby Castillo teach Fernando to throw a screwball, one of baseball's most difficult and rarely used pitches. This unusual pitch, combined with Fernando's unique left-handed windup that included an iconic glance toward the sky, would become his signature. Fernando made his major league debut in September 1980 as a 19-year-old reliever. In just 10 appearances, he threw 17 and 2/3 scoreless innings, giving fans a tantalizing preview of what was to come. But nobody could have predicted what would happen next. The 1981 season changed everything, not just for Fernando, but for baseball itself. When starting pitcher Jerry Roos got injured just hours before opening day, the 20-year-old rookie was thrust into the starting rotation. What followed was one of the most remarkable stretches in baseball history. Fernando won his first 8 starts, all complete games, with 5 shutouts and a nearly perfect 0.50 earned run average. This is where the legend of Fernando Mania was born, and if you're enjoying this incredible story, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments which part of Fernando's journey amazes you most. His rise was absolutely meteoric. Fernando's success wasn't just about statistics. His unusual appearance for an athlete, described as somewhat chubby, made him instantly relatable. Combined with his quiet confidence and that mesmerizing windup, he became magnetic television. Hall of Fame pitcher Carl Hubble called Fernando's screwball the best since his own. Batters had no idea how to handle this pitch that seemed to defy physics, breaking in the opposite direction of what they expected. The 1981 season, though shortened by a player's strike, saw Fernando lead the majors in shutouts and strikeouts while pacing the National League in complete games and innings pitched. He became the first and only player in baseball history to win both the Cy Young Award and Rookie of the Year in the same season. But his impact went far beyond individual accolades. Fernando's success created a cultural phenomenon that transcended sports. For decades, the relationship between the Los Angeles Dodgers and the city's Mexican-American community had been strained. In the 1950s, over 1,800 Mexican-American families were forcibly displaced from their homes in Chavez Ravine to make way for Dodger Stadium. This act left deep wounds in the community. Labor leader Cesar Chavez and other activists had famously refused to attend games as protest. Fernando's arrival provided healing. Here was a player who shared the community's language and heritage, and his dominance allowed them to reclaim their connection to a team that had previously symbolized their displacement. The effect was immediate and measurable. Latino attendance at Dodger Stadium, previously around 5%, soared to 50% on nights Fernando pitched. Radio stations broadcasting Dodgers games in Mexico jumped from 3 to 17. Spanish-language broadcasts in Los Angeles had more than twice the listening audience of their English counterparts. Hall of Fame broadcaster Jaime Jarrin stated that Fernando created more new fans than any other player in Major League history. Vin Scully described the phenomenon as bordering on a religious experience. Fernando became more than a baseball player. He was a cultural hero and beacon of hope, showing that achieving big dreams was possible regardless of circumstances. The financial side of Fernando's success tells another fascinating story. Following his historic rookie season, he faced contentious contract negotiations. In 1982, he demanded an increase from his $42,500 salary to $850,000, while the Dodgers offered just $350,000. As a second-year player without arbitration rights, Fernando had little leverage and eventually settled for $300,000 more than his previous contract. But in 1983, Fernando made history again by becoming the first player to win a $1 million salary through the newly established arbitration process. This was nearly double the league average and more than 28 times the minimum salary. A famous quote attributed to manager Tommy Lasorda noted that Fernando only knew two English words: more money. This period marked a dramatic shift in baseball economics. However, Fernando's incredible success came with a physical price. From 1981 to 1987, he had more wins and strikeouts than any other National League starter. He pitched 6 consecutive seasons with more than 250 innings, a workload now considered unsustainable. His signature screwball was described as almost a physical impossibility, requiring a violent wrist snap that placed considerable strain on his arm. The combination of this physically demanding pitch and an immense workload led to nagging shoulder problems that began to diminish his effectiveness. The toll became evident when he sat out the 1988 World Series postseason with a shoulder injury, missing the Dodgers' championship run. Although he managed to throw a no-hitter in 1990, the physical decline was permanent, and he was released by the Dodgers before the 1991 season. Fernando continued his professional career for 6 more seasons, playing for the California Angels, Baltimore Orioles, Philadelphia Phillies, San Diego Padres, and St. Louis Cardinals before retiring in 1997. He also pitched in Mexico until the 2007 to 2008 season, maintaining his connection to his homeland throughout his career. Following his playing days, Fernando's lasting connection to the game and Los Angeles community continued beautifully. He returned to the Dodgers organization in 2003, serving as a revered Spanish-language broadcaster for over 2 decades until his death. His quiet, humble demeanor and strong connection to the Latino community remained as present in his post-playing career as during his prime. Fernando was heavily involved in community initiatives, including the Amigos de Fernando program, which brought children to games, hosting charity events, and distributing holiday gifts at low-income housing complexes. The continuity of his role as ambassador demonstrated that his legacy wasn't tied solely to athletic performance, but represented genuine, sustained commitment to his community. Fernando's enduring impact has been officially recognized on numerous fronts. In 2023, the Dodgers retired his iconic number 34 jersey, placing him among the franchise's most influential figures. He's also a member of the Mexican Baseball Hall of Fame, Caribbean Baseball Hall of Fame, and California Sports Hall of Fame. The cultural significance of Fernando extends far beyond the baseball diamond. His success opened doors for countless Latino players who followed in his footsteps. Before Fernando, Latino representation in Major League Baseball was limited, and players often faced language barriers and cultural isolation. Fernando's prominence showed that players could maintain their cultural identity while achieving greatness in America's pastime. His influence reached into entertainment and media as well. Fernando appeared in movies, television shows, and commercials, becoming one of the first Latino athletes to achieve true crossover appeal. His image graced magazine covers from Sports Illustrated to Time, making him a household name across multiple demographics. This visibility was crucial during an era when Latino representation in mainstream American media was scarce. The economic impact of Fernando Mania cannot be overstated. Merchandise sales skyrocketed whenever Fernando pitched. His jersey became one of the best-selling items in baseball history. Concession sales at Dodger Stadium increased dramatically on his pitching days, as families who had never attended baseball games before flocked to see their hero in action. Local businesses in Los Angeles experienced booms on Fernando's game days, as the Latino community embraced this opportunity to celebrate their heritage through sports. Fernando's pitching style also influenced the game itself. His success with the screwball inspired other pitchers to experiment with the pitch, though few could master it as he did. Pitching coaches began studying his mechanics, trying to understand how someone with his build and unconventional delivery could be so effective. His approach challenged traditional thinking about what a successful pitcher should look like. The community programs Fernando supported during his playing career and beyond demonstrate his commitment to giving back. He regularly visited schools in Latino neighborhoods, encouraging children to pursue education alongside their dreams. His charity work included funding scholarships for underprivileged students and supporting youth baseball leagues in Mexico and Los Angeles. Fernando Valenzuela's life represents triumph over adversity and the unifying power of sports. His improbable journey from humble beginnings created a cultural force that transcended baseball. Fernando Mania wasn't just a fleeting fad, but a socio-political phenomenon. It helped mend deep community wounds and inspired a generation of Mexican Americans to pursue their dreams. His iconic presence, defined by that unorthodox wind-up and nearly forgotten screwball, was inseparable from his impact as a quiet, humble hero. In his post-playing career, Fernando cemented his status as a lasting icon, providing a direct link to new generations of fans through his broadcasting work. The retirement of his jersey number and numerous Hall of Fame inductions are fitting tributes to a man whose impact on baseball and culture is arguably unmatched. The passing of El Toro closes a chapter on a life as profound and complex as the game he played, leaving behind a legacy that will continue resonating for generations. If this story of triumph and cultural impact inspired you, please subscribe for more incredible sports stories And share your thoughts about Fernando's lasting influence in the comments below. His legacy proves that sports can truly change the world.
And he doesn't have all that much experience. Eric King pitches a lot to me like Saberhagen. He pitches like a 30-year-old, and I really like his tenacity. He goes out after the hitters, and he has the guts of a burglar, and that's what you have to win.
Jim Northrup died a tragic death in 2011 at age 71. He battled Alzheimer's disease and rheumatoid arthritis before a seizure ended his life. But the real tragedy wasn't just the illness. It was watching the very things that made him special slowly disappear: his sharp wit, his ability to think quickly, his brilliant mind. All of it faded away. This was the man they called the Silver Fox, the hero who saved the 1968 World Series for Detroit. His life was about more than clutch hits, though. It was about standing up for what's right, even when it cost him everything. Jim Northrup was born James Thomas Northrup in Breckenridge, Michigan. People gave him two nicknames that told you everything about who he was. First, they called him the Gray Fox because his hair turned gray way too early. But the second nickname mattered more. They called him Sweet Lips because he loved to talk and always spoke his mind. He never held back his opinions, and that honesty would define his entire career. Jim took a different path than most baseball players. He was a multi-sport star at Alma College, playing both baseball and football. Because he went to college, he started playing professional baseball. About 5 years later than everyone else, that college education gave him something special. It made him confident in his intelligence, and he could think through problems in ways other players couldn't. Later on, some managers would see this as a threat. They didn't like players who were too smart or too willing to question things. Even though Jim started late, he was incredible in the minor leagues. His career batting average in the minors was .304, which proved he could hit at a high level. He moved up fast and won awards everywhere he went. In 1962, he won the batting championship in the Duluth Superior League with a .324 average. The next year, 1963, he was named Rookie of the Year in the South Atlantic League while playing for Knoxville. But his best minor league season came in 1964 with the Syracuse Sky Chiefs. He hit .3 out of 12 with 18 home runs and drove in 92 runs. They named him International League Rookie of the Year, and everyone knew he was ready for the big leagues. Jim's first game in the major leagues was September 30th, 1964. It didn't go well. He only got one hit in 12 at-bats during his first 5 games. Things got worse in 1965 when he hit just .205 over 80 games. After dominating in the minors for 3 years, why did he suddenly struggle so badly? The answer wasn't about his talent. It was about how the team used him. The Detroit Tigers had an outfield packed with amazing players. There was Hall of Famer Al Kaline, powerful Willie Horton, and defensive star Mickey Stanley with so much talent. Jim couldn't play every day. They made him a platoon player and a pinch hitter. In 1965, he went only 3 for 24 as a pinch hitter. This showed something important about Jim. He was a rhythm player. He needed to play every day to keep his timing and stay hot. When he only played sometimes, he couldn't get into a groove. His AAA season proved he was talented. He just needed consistent at-bats to show what he could do. Before we go further, drop a comment below and tell us which player from the 1968 Tigers you would have loved to see play. Was it Al Kaline, Willie Horton, or maybe Jim Northrup himself? Everything changed in 1968. That season turned Jim from a struggling backup into one of Detroit's most important players. He played in 150 games and led the entire team in 2 major categories. He had the most hits with 153 and drove in the most runs with 90. He wasn't just contributing anymore, he was carrying the team. Jim became known for hitting in the most important moments. He hit 5 grand slams during the 1968 season. In June, he did something incredible. He hit 3 grand slams in 1 week. Even more amazing, 2 of those grand slams came in back-to-back at-bats against the Cleveland Indians. During his career, he also broke up 3 different no-hitters. He always seemed to come through when it mattered most. But Jim's hitting was streaky. The same week he hit 3 grand slams. He also struck out twice with the bases loaded. This shows how tough he was mentally. Most players would have been crushed after failing in those big moments. Jim bounced back immediately and kept hitting. That mental toughness was part of what made him special. Manager Mayo Smith made a bold decision for the World Series that showed how valuable Jim had become. Mickey Stanley was the regular center fielder and had won a Gold Glove award for his defense, but Smith moved Stanley to shortstop, a position he'd never played before. He did this to replace Ray Oyler, who couldn't hit well. The move let Smith keep Jim Northrup, Willie Horton, and Al Kaline in the lineup every day, with Jim playing center field. This was risky. If Stanley struggled at shortstop, people would blame Smith for the move, but the numbers proved it was the right call. Jim had a 5.3 WR that season, which was almost as good as Willie Horton's 5.2 WAR. His bat was too powerful to keep out of the lineup. Stanley only made 2 errors and 34 chances at shortstop, so the defense held up, but it was Jim's hitting that made the whole strategy work. The World Series against the St. Louis Cardinals was where Jim became a Detroit legend. In Game 6, with the Tigers facing elimination, he hit a grand slam off pitcher Larry Jaster. They won that game 13-1, tying the series and forcing a Game 7. Game 7 was the defining moment of Jim's entire career. The Tigers faced Bob Gibson, one of the greatest pitchers who ever lived. Gibson seemed impossible to beat. The score was tied going into the 7th inning. Jim came up with 2 outs and runners on base. He delivered a 2-run triple that scored Norm Cash and Willie Horton. Those runs gave Detroit a lead they never gave up. The Tigers won 4-1 and captured their first championship in 23 years, but there was controversy around that triple. St. Louis center fielder Curt Flood appeared to misjudge the ball. Many people outside Detroit said the hit only happened because Flood made an error. They acted like it wasn't really a great hit, just a mistake by the defense. This bothered Jim for the rest of his life. Decades later, he was still upset about how people remembered that moment. He felt like saying Flood messed up took away from what Jim had actually done. He needed people to understand the truth. It wasn't about a defensive mistake. It was about him delivering in the biggest moment possible. In 1998, Jim was still angry about it. When someone brought up the play, he got physically intense and said something he really meant. He said there was no way Flood could have caught that ball. He hit it 20 feet over Flood's head. He was disappointed that outside Detroit, people called it the Curt Flood play instead of the Jim Northrup hit. This need to defend his accomplishment showed something important about his character. He cared more about the truth than about accepting an easier story that made him look less skilled. This same honesty would cause problems later in his career. After 1968, Jim's time with the Tigers became difficult because of manager Billy Martin, who took over in the early 1970s. Jim hated how Martin managed the team. He thought he should play every day, but Martin benched him against certain left-handed pitchers. Jim also couldn't stand how Martin would blame players for losses and take credit for wins. One time, Jim's anger exploded. He told Martin that if he didn't want to manage the team, he should get out. That was a direct challenge to the manager's authority, and it made their relationship even worse. Jim's criticism went beyond just disagreeing with baseball decisions. He attacked Martin's character. He said publicly that he had no respect for Martin. He called him dishonest and a user. He said Martin was a huckster who manipulated the press and fans. He went even further, calling Martin paranoid and schizophrenic. Then he said something that connected back to his own background. He said Martin was threatened by anyone who was a college graduate. This showed the real source of their conflict. Jim's college education gave him intellectual confidence. Martin saw that confidence as a threat to his authority. After the first year, Martin would blame players for every defeat. The players lost all respect for him. In 1972, the team decided to win in spite of their manager. Not because of him. The worst moment came after a tough loss. Martin stormed into the locker room and challenged any player who wanted to fight him to come into his office. Willie Horton urged Jim to take the challenge, but Jim showed how smart he really was. He refused to fight Martin. He said he wasn't going to give Martin the satisfaction of seeing management trade him away. He knew he would pound Martin and then be gone from the team. This decision proved Jim could control his emotions when it mattered. He wanted to fight Martin, but he knew the consequences. If he did it, he would lose his career. Martin was impulsive and emotional. Jim was calculating and smart. By refusing to fight, he proved everything he'd said about Martin was true. He also showed he could think strategically even when he was angry. The tension between them represented something bigger than just two men who didn't like each other. It was about authority versus independence. It was about managers who demanded blind loyalty versus players who thought for themselves. Jim represented a new kind of ball player, one who wouldn't just follow orders without question, one who valued truth and integrity over keeping his head down and collecting a paycheck. This made him dangerous to people like Martin who needed complete control. The conflict showed that baseball was changing. Players were becoming more educated, more willing to stand up for themselves, more willing to call out hypocrisy when they saw it. Jim was ahead of his time in many ways, and that made his career harder than it should have been. The relationship between players and managers in that era was built on a military-style hierarchy. Managers expected complete obedience and rarely tolerated questions or criticism. Players were supposed to accept whatever decisions were made without complaint. This system worked when players had limited education and few options, but as more players attended college and understood their value, the old system began to break down. Jim was part of that transition. He represented a future where players had more power and autonomy, where they could speak up about unfair treatment without fear of immediate retaliation. But that future hadn't fully arrived yet, so Jim paid a price for being ahead of his time. His conflicts with Martin weren't just personality clashes, they were battles over how baseball should be structured, who should have power, and whether players had the right to question authority. Jim had strong opinions about everything in baseball, not just managers. When people talked about steroids and performance-enhancing drugs, he gave an honest answer that most people wouldn't say out loud. He admitted steroids were illegal, but he said owners chose to look the other way. Why? Because home runs are good for the game and good for making money. Baseball didn't want to catch the users. Jim said it was always about money. The owners didn't care about the integrity of the game or the players' health. It had always been about money and always would be. Then he said something even more shocking. He admitted he probably would have taken steroids himself to earn more money and increase his salary, but he added an important condition. He would have required blood tests to check for health dangers. This wasn't about cheating in Jim's mind. It was a calculated financial transaction. He saw the system as corrupt, driven by profit. If he played within that corrupt system to make money, that was just being realistic. But he did criticize modern players who lied about using steroids. He said Barry Bonds was no Willie Mays and never would be. The lying was the problem, not the decision to use the drugs. His views on steroids revealed something important about his philosophy. Jim believed in honesty above all else. He didn't judge people for making choices that benefited them financially, especially in a system that was already corrupt. But he couldn't stand dishonesty and pretending. If you were going to use steroids, own it. Don't lie to fans and pretend you achieved everything naturally. That hypocrisy bothered him more than the actual drug use. Jim also had ideas about how to change baseball. He claimed he suggested interleague play back in the 1960s. Commissioner William Harridge dismissed the idea, saying interleague play already existed in spring training. This showed Jim was thinking ahead about the business side of baseball, not just playing. In other ways, Jim was very traditional. He hated pitch counts and would scold teammates for being friendly with players on the other team. That was old school thinking, but he was fine with the designated hitter, which showed he could accept some changes. After Jim retired in 1975, following short stints with the Montreal Expos and Baltimore Orioles, he stayed involved with baseball. He played professional softball for a couple of years with former Tigers teammate Norm Cash. He also started a business called Jim Northrup and Associates in Southfield, Michigan. From 1985 to 1994, Jim worked as a color analyst for Tigers television broadcast on the Pass Sports Cable Network. He often worked with Al Kaline, and fans loved listening to him. But his broadcasting career ended suddenly. New ownership took over and fired him. The reason they gave was incredibly revealing. They were afraid Jim would be too critical of the new regime. This was exactly like his conflict with Billy Martin. Once again, people in power saw Jim's honesty and analytical thinking as a threat. They wanted someone who would say what they wanted to hear, not someone who would tell the truth. Jim was an old schooler who had strong opinions and loved to talk. Those qualities made him great on television, but they also made management nervous. They wanted control, and they knew Jim would never give them that. The broadcasting industry was changing. Networks wanted announcers who would promote the team and keep fans happy. They didn't want critical voices who might point out problems or question decisions. Jim's firing represented a larger shift in sports media, away from honest analysis and toward corporate messaging. It was another example of how his integrity cost him professionally, but it also proved he never compromised who he was, even when staying quiet would have been easier and more profitable. In 2000, Jim was inducted into the Michigan Sports Hall of Fame. That recognition honored everything he'd accomplished on the field, but later in life, he faced his toughest battle. He developed rheumatoid arthritis, which was painful. Then he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. The Alzheimer's diagnosis was particularly cruel for Jim. His entire identity was built on being smart, quick-witted, and able to express complex ideas. The disease slowly took all of that away. The very qualities that defined who he was, his sharp mind and ability to speak his truth, gradually disappeared. Watching someone with such a powerful intellect lose their mental faculties is heartbreaking. For Jim's family and friends, it must have been especially difficult. This was a man who always had something to say, who could analyze any situation and express his thoughts clearly. Now he was losing the ability to think and communicate. The progression of Alzheimer's is cruel and relentless. It strips away everything that makes a person who they are. For someone like Jim, whose mind was his greatest asset beyond his physical skills, the loss was devastating. Memories of his greatest moments, his World Series heroics, his battles with Billy Martin, all of it slowly faded from his consciousness. The man who spent decades defending the truth about his Game 7 triple eventually forgot it ever happened. That's the cruelty of Alzheimer's. It doesn't just take away the future, it erases the past. On June 8, 2011, Jim died in Holly, Michigan. He was 71 years old. A seizure related to his Alzheimer's disease ended his life. Jim Northrup's legacy is about two things. First, his clutch performance in the 1968 World Series, especially that Game 7 triple off Bob Gibson, made him a Detroit hero forever. His career numbers were solid. A .267 batting average, 153 home runs, and 610 runs batted in. Those statistics show he was a productive power hitter whose best years made a huge impact, but his second legacy might be even more important. Jim was a voice of dissent who always prioritized truth over convenience. He spent decades defending his Game 7 hit against the narrative that it was Flood's error. He ruthlessly analyzed Billy Martin, calling him dishonest and a user. He gave a pragmatic, economically focused view of steroid use that most people wouldn't dare express. His honesty caused professional problems. He calculated carefully to avoid fighting Martin because he knew it would end his career. Years later, he was fired from broadcasting for being too critical, but that same honesty is what made him unforgettable. He spoke his mind and proved that candor and calculation, even when they caused institutional problems, could secure an unforgettable place in history. Jim Northrup was the Silver Fox, a hero of the diamond and a resolute critic of baseball's management. He hit when it mattered most and never backed down from speaking the truth. His story reminds us that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to compromise your values, even when it costs you opportunities, even when it makes people uncomfortable, even when staying quiet would be easier. Jim never took the easy path. He challenged authority when he believed it was wrong. He defended his accomplishments when others tried to diminish them. He spoke honestly about controversial topics when others remained silent. That kind of courage is rare in any field, but especially in professional sports where conformity is often rewarded and dissent is punished. His willingness to speak truth to power, whether that power was Billy Martin or team ownership or the baseball establishment itself, marked him as someone special, not just an athlete, but a thinker, not just a player, but a critic of the game he loved. If you found this story inspiring, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us what you think about Jim's legacy. Should more players speak out like he did, or is it better to stay quiet? Let us know below.
One of the greatest starting pitchers in baseball history died on Monday. Tom Seaver passed peacefully in his sleep of complications of Lewy body dementia and COVID-19, according to the Baseball Hall of Fame.
He was the franchise. He was one of a kind. You know, he's a Hall of Famer's Hall of Famer.
Tom Seaver's life was a story where MLB destroyed him. On August 31st, 2020, baseball lost one of its greatest legends when George Thomas Seaver passed away at the age of 75. The official cause was complications from Lewy body dementia and COVID-19, but his death was just the final chapter in a life that was defined by towering achievement and profound institutional betrayal. This was a man who gave everything to his team, only to have his loyalty thrown back in his face. His wife, Nancy Seaver, put it best when she said, "With him, it was a matter of loyalty, and his loyalty was thrown into his face." Tom Seaver, known as Tom Terrific and the franchise, was the heart and soul of the New York Mets. But before we talk about how he became a legend, we need to talk about how the organization that he built turned its back on him in the cruelest way possible. The story of Tom Seaver's betrayal begins in the mid-1970s. Baseball was changing. The reserve clause had ended and a new era of free agency was born. Player salaries were exploding across the league. In 1974, Catfish Hunter signed a massive deal with the Yankees worth $3.75 million. The financial power of players was growing, and the old guard in baseball management hated it. Tom Seaver was the undisputed ace of the Mets. He had earned 3 Cy Young Awards and was one of the best pitchers in the entire game. By 1977, he was seeking a 3-year contract worth $800,000. This was not some outrageous demand. The highest salary in MLB that year was $560,000, earned by Mike Schmidt. Nolan Ryan, Seaver's contemporary, was also earning $560,000 and would soon become baseball's first $1 million a year player in 1980. Seaver was simply asking for what he was worth. He was staking his claim as the league's top star, and his performance on the mound justified every dollar. But Mets chairman M. Donald Grant refused to negotiate in good faith. Grant was a buttoned-down, authoritarian Wall Street stockbroker who fiercely resisted the new economic order. He had tight-fisted fiscal policies that drew criticism from everyone. The conflict between Grant and Seaver quickly became less about money and more about power and control. Grant viewed the new era of player empowerment as a threat to the established hierarchy. He believed players should accept wages comparable to the average American worker. Seaver later recalled 2 statements from Grant that showed what he called the chairman's total plantation mentality. During labor negotiations, Grant confronted Seaver and asked, "What are you, some sort of communist?" He also questioned Seaver's social aspirations, asking, "Who do you think you are, joining the Greenwich Country Club?" These statements were not about business. They were about keeping a player in his place. Grant viewed Seaver's attempt to achieve market value not as a simple business transaction, but as an act of moral failure. The professional disagreement was fundamentally philosophical. It was a traditional management model fighting against player autonomy. The trade that would eventually happen was not because the Mets could not afford Seaver. It was a punitive act. Grant chose to dismantle the franchise cornerstone rather than concede that the player deserved economic mobility. Seaver was being thwarted by spiteful ideology. The frustration that Seaver felt during this period cannot be overstated. He had been with the Mets since the beginning of his professional career. He had carried the franchise on his back. He had transformed them from a laughingstock into World Series champions in 1969. That championship team, the Miracle Mets, was built around his arm and his leadership. He was not just another player looking for a payday. He was the face of the franchise. He was the reason fans came to Shea Stadium. He was the reason the Mets were relevant. And yet he was being treated like he was asking for something he did not deserve. The disrespect was palpable. Grant's refusal to acknowledge Seaver's value was not just bad business. It was a personal insult. It was a message that no matter how much Seaver had accomplished, no matter how much he had given to the organization, he would never be seen as anything more than a worker who should be grateful for whatever crumbs names the owners decided to throw his way. This corporate hubris and media manipulation forced the greatest pitcher in their history out of town. What's your take? Should a player's career be ended because management allows an attack on his family? Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more stories of professional sports betrayal, be sure to subscribe. While Grant's financial obstinance created the professional stalemate, the ultimate catalyst that forced Seaver out of New York was a newspaper columnist named Dick Young. Young wrote for the New York Daily News and consistently positioned himself as an advocate for management against the perceived greed of players. He frequently attacked Seaver in his articles, but here is where things get really troubling. Young's son-in-law Thornton Geary was employed by the Mets organization. Grant himself had hired him. This direct connection suggests that Young was acting as a public relations attack dog for the front office. He was possibly receiving insider information to craft his caustic columns. Young painted Seaver as greedy and deceptive. He argued that Seaver was merely masking his desire for hard cash with talk of team competitiveness. The relationship between Young and the Mets front office was deeply unethical. Here was a journalist who was supposed to be reporting objectively on the team, but he had a direct financial connection to the organization through his son-in-law's employment. This was a massive conflict of interest. Young was essentially being used as a propaganda tool by Grant. His job was not to inform the public. His job was to shape public opinion against Seaver. He was there to make Seaver look bad so that when the trade eventually happened, the fans would blame Seaver instead of blaming the front office. It was a calculated strategy. It was media manipulation at its worst, and it worked. Many fans, influenced by Young's relentless attacks, began to see Seaver as the problem. They began to believe that he was being selfish. They began to think that maybe he was asking for too much. This was exactly what Grant wanted. He wanted the narrative to be about Seaver's greed, not about his own refusal to pay a fair market value. But the breaking point occurred when Young transformed the professional discord into an irreparable personal betrayal. In a particularly nasty and unsubstantiated story, Young claimed that Seaver's wife Nancy was the driving force behind the demands for a higher salary. Young wrote that Nancy was envious of her friend, Ruth Ryan, whose husband Nolan Ryan was earning more money. This was a lie. It was a cruel personal attack designed to humiliate Seaver and his family. Seaver was reportedly furious and incensed that Young had dragged his wife into it. This was the final blow. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. The attack on his family's integrity was intolerable. Seaver immediately confronted the front office and demanded a trade. He stated definitively that he was done with the Mets. The trade that followed was a forced exit. It was predicated on profound personal betrayal rather than simple contractual necessity. This sequence of events demonstrates the power of media manipulation to dictate the fate of a superstar. Seaver was willing to fight for his contract, but he would not endure an environment where management permitted, or perhaps orchestrated, a public smear campaign against his personal life. The decision to drag Nancy Seaver into the dispute was particularly vile. Nancy had nothing to do with the contract negotiations. She was not demanding anything. She was simply supporting her husband in his efforts to get paid what he was worth. But Young saw an opportunity to inflict maximum damage. He knew that by attacking Nancy, he would hit Seaver where it hurt most. He knew that Seaver would not tolerate his wife being slandered in the press. And he was right. The attack on Nancy was the one thing that Seaver could not forgive. It was the one thing that made reconciliation impossible. Young had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. And in doing so, he had ensured that Tom Seaver would never wear a Mets uniform again, at least not for a very long time. In the final hours of June 15, 1977, the trade was executed. It was dubbed the Midnight Massacre. Tom Seaver, who at 32 was 7-3 with a 3.00 ERA and widely considered the best pitcher in the game, was sent to the Cincinnati Reds. In return, the Mets received Pat Zachary, Doug Flynn, Steve Henderson, and Dan Norman. These were four players collectively described in the New York Times as being of far less magnitude. To compound the disaster, slugger Dave Kingman, who was also involved in a contract dispute, was traded to the San Diego Padres that same night. The public reaction in New York was immediate and overwhelming. The New York Daily News dedicated its entire front page to the story. The headline screamed, "Mets deal stars, Seaver to Reds, Kingman to SD." The Mets switchboard was flooded with telephone calls, mostly of protest, many of them very abusive. It was described as the strongest display of anger ever recorded there. The day after the trade, Mets fans were in a state of shock and disbelief. How could the organization trade away the greatest player in franchise history? How could they let Tom Seaver go? The answer was simple. Donald Grant's ego and his outdated ideology were more important to him than winning baseball games. He would rather destroy the team than admit that he was wrong. He would rather lose the best pitcher in baseball than pay him what he was worth. The Midnight Massacre was not just a bad trade. It was an act of organizational sabotage. It was a deliberate decision to prioritize ideology over success, and the fans knew it. They knew that Grant had destroyed their team. They knew that the Mets would not be competitive for years to come, and they were right. The organizational collapse that followed was immediate and prolonged. Grant's decision to jettison Seaver rather than meet a market demand was a short-term financial saving that resulted in a systemic decline. Grant continued his refusal to sign free agents. The franchise was thrust into a full rebuild that devolved devolved into a 7-year miserable stretch. From 1977 to 1983, the Mets won just 434 games and lost 641. That is an overall win percentage of 40.4%. The lack of competitiveness caused attendance to plummet. Detractors across the city began mockingly referring to Shea Stadium as Grant's Tomb, a reference to the monument honoring Ulysses S. Grant. Emmy Donald Grant became a public laughingstock. He was widely viewed as the chief culprit for the gutted franchise. The severity of the public and competitive backlash eventually led to his downfall. In November 1978, the Mets board of directors relieved Grant of his duties as board chairman. His disgraced status was confirmed when he made only discreet entrances to Shea Stadium thereafter, fearing the fan reception. The financial saving achieved by denying Seaver his justified contract was ultimately dwarfed by the total loss of fan interest and competitive failure over the subsequent decade. The Midnight Massacre serves as a definitive case study in how owner hubris, driven by ideological spite, can financially and emotionally ruin a major corporate asset. The 7 years that followed the trade were some of the darkest in Mets history. The team was terrible, the fans stopped coming to games, the organization became a joke, and all of it could have been avoided if Emma Donald Grant had simply paid Tom Seaver what he was worth. Instead, Grant chose pride over pragmatism. He chose ideology over success, and he paid the price. His removal from the chairmanship in 1978 was a humiliating end to his tenure. He had taken a championship-caliber team and turned it into a laughingstock. He had taken the best pitcher in baseball and traded him for a handful of mediocre players, and he had destroyed the trust and goodwill of an entire fan base. Grant's legacy is one of failure and stubbornness. He is remembered not for any success he brought to the Mets, but for the damage he inflicted on the franchise. The name Grant's Tomb was a fitting epitaph for his tenure. It was a reminder that his decisions had killed the team. The players who came to the Mets in exchange for Seaver never lived up to expectations. Pat Zachary, Doug Flynn, Steve Henderson, and Dan Norman were serviceable players, but none of them came close to matching Seaver's impact. The trade was lopsided from the start. The Mets gave up a Hall of Fame pitcher in his prime and received 4 players who would be forgotten footnotes in baseball history. It was a disaster of epic proportions. And every time one of those players stepped onto the field at Shea Stadium, it was a reminder to the fans of what they had lost. The trade haunted the organization for years. It became the defining moment of a terrible era, and it all happened because of one man's stubbornness and spite. Despite the bitterness of his departure, Seaver demonstrated remarkable professional resilience. His tenure with the Cincinnati Reds proved that his excellence was not dependent on the Mets organization. It was a successful second act in his Hall of Fame career. Over 6 seasons with the Reds, Seaver won 75 games. He led the National League in wins in 1981, securing his continuing status as an elite pitcher. He did experience a brief redemptive return to the Mets in 1983. However, even this momentary reconciliation ended in another organizational blunder. This reinforced the perception that the Mets management was incapable of properly managing the franchise. Following the 1983 season, the Mets failed to protect Seaver on their roster's unprotected list for the free agent compensation. This was an act of sloppy management that allowed the Chicago White Sox to pluck him away. The loss was particularly acute because the subsequent vacant spot in the starting rotation allowed a young rookie named Dwight Gooden to make the team coming out of spring training in 1984. Seaver finished his career with the White Sox and Boston Red Sox. He achieved his 300th victory and retired with an unparalleled career mark of 311 wins, a 2.86 ERA, and 3,040 strikeouts. The 1983 return to the Mets was supposed to be a feel-good story. Seaver was back in New York. He was back where he belonged. The fans were thrilled. For a brief moment, it seemed like the wrongs of the past could be forgiven, but the Mets front office managed to mess it up again. Their failure to protect Seaver on the roster was not a malicious act like the 1977 trade. It was simply incompetence. It was organizational sloppiness, but the result was the same. Seaver was gone. Once again, the Mets had lost their greatest player because the front office could not get its act together. The pattern was clear. Whether it was ideological spite or simple incompetence, the Mets organization could not hold on to Tom Seaver. They did not deserve him. They had never deserved. The fact that Seaver was traded once due to ideological spite and lost a second time due to organizational negligence suggests that the initial betrayal was symptomatic of a deep-seated pathology within the franchise. It proved that the Mets organization rarely did right by the franchise. This lack of respect continued into his retirement. Years after his Hall of Fame election, Nancy Seaver publicly expressed being embarrassed for the Mets due to their perceived failure to properly honor her husband. Following his playing career, Seaver transitioned into broadcasting. He worked as a television color commentator for both the Mets and Yankees. This public role allowed him to maintain a connection to the game he loved. It bridged his legendary status with continuous fan engagement, even while physically distanced from the New York chaos. Even in retirement, the disrespect continued. The Mets never fully honored Seaver the way they should have. They never fully acknowledged the debt they owed him. Nancy Seaver's public statement about being embarrassed for the Mets was a damning indictment of the organization. Here was the wife of the greatest player in franchise history saying that the team had failed to properly properly honor her husband. That is a stain on the organization that can never be fully washed away. Seaver deserved better. He deserved to be treated like the legend he was. But the Mets, true to form, could not even get that right. Seaver's broadcasting career allowed him to stay connected to baseball in a meaningful way. He provided analysis and commentary for games. He shared his knowledge and experience with a new generation of fans. He remained a respected voice in the sport. But even this phase of his life was tinged with the bitterness of what had happened to him as a player. Every time he stepped into a broadcast booth, every time he talked about the game, there must have been a part of him that remembered the betrayal. There must have been a part of him that wondered what his career could have been if the Mets had simply treated him with the respect he deserved. The what-ifs must have haunted him. What if Grant had paid him? What if Young had not attacked his wife? What if the Mets had protected him in 1983? These questions could never be answered. The past could not be changed. And so Seaver carried on, broadcasting games and trying to find peace with the way his career had unfolded. The contrast between what Seaver accomplished and how he was treated is one of the most frustrating aspects of his story. Here was a man who transformed an expansion team into champions. He was the centerpiece of the Miracle Mets. He gave New York one of its greatest sports moments. And yet, when it came time to compensate him fairly, the organization balked. When it came time to show him loyalty, they showed him the door instead. The betrayal was complete and total, and it left scars that never fully healed. Even decades later, even after he had achieved every honor the game could bestow, the memory of how the Mets treated him lingered. It was a wound that never closed. But the ultimate tragedy of Tom Seaver's life was the slow, inexorable decline of his once dominant mind and body due to complex neurological conditions. And this personal battle began long before his death. It stemmed from a severe, persistent environmental disease. Seaver's medical history included an initial diagnosis of Lyme disease in 1991. He contracted it while working in his garden in Connecticut. The tick-borne illness reoccurred around 2012. This marked the beginning of clear and distressing neurological involvement. The recurrence caused a variety of debilitating symptoms. These included the onset of Bell's palsy and significant memory loss. By 2013, reports indicated that Seaver was suffering from severe memory impairment. He had difficulty recognizing long-term acquaintances. He experienced a sleep disorder, nausea, and a general overall feeling of chemical imbalance. Former teammates, such as Bud Harrelson, noted that he would forget things that happened just a few minutes before. This decade of cognitive decline culminated in the formal diagnosis of Lewy body dementia in 2019. Lewy body dementia is the second most common form of dementia. The decline of Tom Seaver's health was heartbreaking to witness. Here was a man who had been one of the greatest athletes of his generation. He had been sharp, intelligent, and fiercely competitive, and now his mind was failing him. The memory loss was particularly cruel. Seaver could not remember conversations he had just had. He could not recognize people he had known for decades. The disease was robbing him of his identity. It was stealing his memories. It was taking away everything that made him who he was. For someone who had spent his entire life in control, who had mastered his craft to a degree that few ever have, the loss of control over his own mind must have been unbearable. The frustration and sadness that Seaver and his family must have felt during this period is unimaginable. The symptoms of Lewy body dementia are devastating. The memory loss is just one part of it. The disease also causes visual hallucinations, motor problems, and severe cognitive impairment. Patients often experience fluctuations in their mental state where they can be alert and coherent one moment and confused and disoriented the next. This unpredictability makes the disease especially difficult for families to manage. For Nancy Seaver, watching her husband slowly fade away must have been agonizing. She had stood by him through the betrayals and the disappointments of his playing career. She had supported him through everything, and now she had to watch as the disease took him from her piece by piece. The Seaver family's decision to publicly announce his diagnosis in 2019 was an act of courage. They wanted people to understand what was happening. They wanted to raise awareness about dementia and the challenges it presents, and they wanted to give Tom the privacy and dignity he deserved in his final years. The connection between Seaver's history of Lyme disease and his subsequent development of Lewy body dementia introduces a crucial element of medical complexity to his final years. Emerging medical research suggests a possible correlation between persistent chronic Lyme infection and the onset of severe neurological diseases like Lewy body dementia. A case study involving a patient who experienced years of neurocognitive impairment following Lyme diagnosis and treatment found evidence of persistent Lyme bacteria in the brain tissue of the patient, who ultimately succumbed to Lewy body dementia. Researchers are actively investigating the role that persistent Lyme bacteria may play in facilitating the progression of dementia. This perspective frames Seaver's death not merely as a consequence of advanced age, but as a drawn-out, medically complex tragedy initiated by a chronic, often misunderstood environmental illness. The fact that Lyme disease may have contributed to Seaver's dementia adds another layer of tragedy to his story. Lyme disease is often dismissed as a minor illness, but in Seaver's case, it may have been the beginning of the end. The reoccurrence of the disease in 2012 marked the start of his neurological decline, and over the next 8 years, his condition only got worse. The emerging research into the connection between Lyme disease and dementia is still in its early stages, but the evidence is mounting that chronic Lyme infection can have devastating long-term effects on the brain. Seaver may have been a victim of this connection. His death may have been the result of an environmental illness that was never fully understood or treated. It is a sobering reminder that even the greatest among us are vulnerable to forces beyond our control. The frustration of his final years was the inability to combat the irreversible decline of his cognitive function. This forced him into isolation. He retired from public life. The family formally announced his diagnosis with dementia in March 2019. He immediately retired from public life. This retirement meant the legendary pitcher was unable to join his former teammates in New York to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the 1969 Miracle Mets World Series championship. This was a team he defined. His quiet dignity in his final years was spent away from the professional chaos. He cultivated Seaver vineyards with his family in Calistoga, California. This stands in sharp contrast to the furious and toxic environment that forced his 1977 departure. His peaceful passing on August 31, 2020, from complications of Lewy body dementia and the COVID-19 virus, sadly confirms that his final days were characterized by the acute vulnerability associated with terminal neurological disease during a global pandemic. The fact that Seaver could not attend the 50th anniversary celebration of the 1969 Miracle Mets was another cruel twist of fate. That championship was the defining moment of his career. It was the moment when he became a legend, and he could not be there to celebrate it. He could not share in the joy and the memories with his former teammates. He was isolated in California, battling a disease that was slowly taking everything from him. The contrast between the Seaver of 1969 and the Seaver of 2019 is stark. In 1969, he was young, strong, and at the peak of his powers. In 2019, he was old, sick, and fading away. The passage of time had been cruel to him, and the disease had robbed him of the chance to fully enjoy his legacy. The final indignity came in 2020 when Seaver contracted COVID-19. Already weakened by Lewy body dementia, his body could not fight off the virus. The combination of chronic neurological disease and acute viral infection was too much. On August 31, 2020, Tom Seaver died peacefully in his sleep. He was 75 years old. The news of his death sent shockwaves through the baseball world. Tributes poured in from all over. Players, coaches, and fans all mourned the loss of one of the greatest pitchers in history. But the sadness was tinged with frustration. Seaver had deserved better. He had deserved a long, happy retirement. He had deserved to be honored and celebrated. Instead, his final years were marked by illness, isolation, and decline. It was a tragic end to a tragic story. But despite all of this tragedy, all of this frustration, and all of this betrayal, Tom Seaver's legacy is defined by his resilience, his excellence, and his unbreakable connection to the Mets fans who adored him. He finished his career with statistics that place him among the greatest pitchers in history. This was confirmed by his near-unanimous Hall of Fame election in 1992. He received 98.8% of the vote. This was the highest percentage ever recorded at the time. The life of Tom Seaver encapsulates a powerful narrative of American sports tragedy. Towering individual achievement was constantly undermined by institutional failure and personal illness. The frustration he experienced in 1977, driven by the ideological malice of M.S. Donald Grant and the unethical journalism of Dick Young, not only forced him from the team he defined, but directly caused a decade of organizational ruin. The era was characterized by the ignominious label Grant's Tomb. His story serves as a profound cautionary tale. It is a reminder that corporate hubris and media manipulation can inflict deep, lasting wounds. But true greatness transcends the petty conflicts created by those who oppose progress. Seaver remains and always will be the heart and soul of the Mets. The Hall of Fame vote in 1992 was a testament to Seaver's greatness. 98.8% of voters selected him on their ballot. This was the highest percentage ever recorded at that time. It was a near-unanimous recognition of his place among the all-time greats. The voters understood what the Mets front office never did. They understood that Tom Seaver was special. They understood that he was a once-in-a-generation talent. They understood that he deserved to be celebrated and honored. The Hall of Fame induction was a validation of everything Seaver had accomplished. It was proof that his legacy would endure long after the petty conflicts and betrayals of his playing days had been forgotten. Tom Seaver's story is one of triumph and tragedy. He achieved greatness on the baseball field. He won championships, he won awards, he became a legend, but he was also betrayed by the organization he loved. He was attacked by the media. He was denied the respect and compensation he deserved. And in the end, he was struck down by a terrible disease that robbed him of his memories and his dignity. It is a story that should make us angry. It should make us frustrated. It should make us demand better from the institutions that control professional sports. Players like Tom Seaver give everything to their teams. They sacrifice their bodies, they dedicate their lives to the game, and they deserve to be treated with respect and fairness. When they are not, when they are betrayed and discarded, it is a stain on the entire sport. His vineyard in Calistoga became his sanctuary in those final years. Away from the noise and chaos of New York, Seaver found peace among the grapevines. He worked the land with his hands, much like he had done in that Connecticut garden where he first contracted Lyme disease. The vineyard represented a new chapter, a quiet escape from the betrayals and frustrations that had marked his baseball career. It was a place where he could be himself, where he did not have to be Tom Terrific or the franchise. He could just be Tom Seaver, a man who loved working with his hands and watching things grow. But even this peaceful sanctuary could not protect him from the ravages of disease that were slowly consuming his mind. The irony is painful to consider. Seaver escaped New York to find peace in California. He built a life cultivating grapes and making wine. He created something beautiful and lasting with his own hands. And yet, the disease that would eventually kill him started in a garden. It started with a tick bite while he was doing the very thing that brought him joy, working with the land, creating something from nothing. The same drive that made him a great pitcher, the same work ethic and attention to detail led him to gardening. And that garden, that peaceful place where he found solace, became the source of his ultimate downfall. It is a cruel twist that adds yet another layer of tragedy to an already heartbreaking story. That is the story of Tom Seaver, a man who gave everything to his team only to have his loyalty thrown back in his face. Let us know what you think about the franchise and hit the like button if you want more stories that showcase the tragic side of sports greatness. Baseball's biggest addict just died, and the truth behind Dave Parker's death reveals a story darker than most fans knew. The Cobra passed away on June 28, 2025, at age 74 from Parkinson's disease complications. But his death came just 29 days before he was supposed to be inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame. This timing wasn't just cruel luck. It was the final chapter in a life filled with addiction, controversy, and broken promises that kept him out of Cooperstown for decades. Dave Parker was once baseball royalty. In the late 1970s, he was everything a superstar should be. He could hit for power and average, steal bases, play amazing defense, and had an arm that could throw out runners from anywhere in right field. He won back-to-back National League batting titles in 1977 and 1978. In 1978, he was the unanimous MVP winner after leading the league in multiple categories. He was the All-Star Game MVP in 1979 and helped the Pittsburgh Pirates win the World Series that same year. Parker seemed destined for greatness, but then came the contract that changed everything. In January 1979, Parker signed a 5-year deal that made him baseball's first $1 million per year player. The timing couldn't have been worse for his reputation. Pittsburgh was falling apart economically. The steel industry had collapsed, taking 95,000 jobs with it. Families were struggling to put food on the table while Parker was getting rich playing a game. The fans turned on him immediately. They booed him relentlessly at home games. Worse than that, angry fans threw batteries, nuts, and bolts at him while he played right field. Parker later admitted that being the first black player to make that kind of money made the situation even harder. The city that once loved him now saw him as a symbol of everything wrong with professional sports. He went from hero to villain almost overnight. The money was just the beginning of Parker's problems. What fans didn't know was that their former hero was developing a serious cocaine addiction. From 1979 to 1982, Parker was using drugs regularly. He later testified that cocaine was constantly available because of his celebrity status. His performance started to suffer, and by his own admission, his game was slipping because of the drugs. Everything came crashing down in 1985 during the Pittsburgh drug trials. This wasn't some minor scandal. It was a federal investigation that exposed widespread cocaine use throughout Major League Baseball. Parker found himself at the center of it all. To avoid criminal charges, he accepted legal immunity in exchange for testifying against drug dealers. In a packed courtroom with reporters from every major news outlet watching, Parker admitted his addiction to the world. His testimony was devastating for his reputation. He confessed to using cocaine with consistency for 3 years. He admitted that his drug use had made his performance worse. The man who was supposed to be a role model for kids had become the poster child for everything wrong with baseball in the 1980s. The scandal didn't just hurt Parker personally. It changed how the entire sport dealt with drug issues. The fallout was immediate and brutal. Commissioner Peter Ueberroth suspended Parker and several other players for a full year. Though the suspension was later reduced, Parker had to donate 10% of his salary to drug programs, submit to mandatory drug testing for the rest of his career, and perform 100 hours of community service. But the real punishment came from his own team. The Pittsburgh Pirates, now under new ownership, decided they didn't want to pay Parker the millions still owed on his 1979 contract. They sued him, claiming his drug use was a breach of contract that negatively affected his performance and poisoned the team's relationship with fans. Parker was forced to settle out of court for significantly less money than he was originally promised. If you're shocked by how far Parker fell from grace, make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments what you think about athletes who let addiction destroy their careers. His story shows just how quickly fame and fortune can disappear. The lawsuit left Parker bitter and angry. He later said he felt nothing but malice and hate for the Pirates organization. He believed they failed to acknowledge his years as one of baseball's best players. The relationship between Parker and Pittsburgh seemed permanently damaged. The drugs had cost him money, respect, and his place in the community that once adored him. To make matters worse, he was traded to Oakland in December 1987, ending his time with the team that had made him a star. Parker's problems extended far beyond Pittsburgh. When he became eligible for the Baseball Hall of Fame, voters remembered the scandal more than his statistics. For 15 years, he appeared on the writers' ballot. Despite having over 2,700 hits, 339 home runs, and 1,493 RBIs, he never received more than 25% of the vote. The 75% needed for induction seemed impossible to reach. His association with the drug trials had effectively blackballed him from baseball's most exclusive club. Voters felt that his off-field behavior outweighed his on-field accomplishments. The same scandal that had cost him money and respect was now keeping him out of Cooperstown. Other players from the drug trials, like Keith Hernandez, faced similar struggles getting Hall of Fame recognition. Parker's career did have some bright moments after the scandal. He had a late resurgence with the Cincinnati Reds in 1985, finishing second in MVP voting. He won another World Series with the Oakland Athletics in 1989, but these achievements couldn't erase the damage done by the drug trials and the years of negative publicity that followed. After retiring in 1991, Parker largely stayed out of the spotlight. He had been one of only 5 players in history with at least 500 doubles, 300 home runs, 150 stolen bases, and 2,700 hits. His statistical resume was clearly Hall of Fame worthy, but the voters who remembered his cocaine years weren't ready to forgive and forget. Time slowly began to heal some wounds. In 2012, Parker was diagnosed with Parkinson's disease, though he didn't make it public until 2013. The diagnosis was hard for someone who had always seen himself as a baseball warrior. He initially struggled to accept help from others, finding it difficult to show vulnerability after years of projecting strength and confidence. But Parker's battle with Parkinson's started to change how people saw him. He established a foundation to raise awareness about the disease and support research efforts. His public struggle with a debilitating condition showed a more human side that fans hadn't seen during his playing days. The man who had once been defined by his swagger and controversy was now fighting a different kind of battle. The disease led to an unexpected reconciliation with Pittsburgh. When Parker returned for a 1979 team reunion, fans who had once thrown objects at him gave him a heartfelt standing ovation. The city that had turned against him decades earlier was finally ready to separate the player from his past mistakes. In 2022, he was inducted into the inaugural Pittsburgh Pirates Hall of Fame. Parker's health continued to decline as Parkinson's took its toll. He needed double knee replacement surgery from years of wear and tear on his body. The once powerful athlete was becoming increasingly frail, but his courage in facing these challenges earned him respect from fans and former players alike. On December 8, 2024, the Classic Baseball Era Committee finally gave Parker what he had been waiting for since 1997. He was elected to the National Baseball Hall of Fame, receiving 14 of 16 votes. After decades of being shut out by writers who couldn't forget his drug use, a special committee was willing to focus on his complete body of work. The election should have been the perfect ending to Parker's story. After all the controversy, lawsuits, and health problems, he was finally going to take his place among baseball's immortals. He had kept his planned induction speech for 15 years, waiting for this moment. Everything seemed to be falling into place for a triumphant conclusion to his complicated career. But fate had other plans. On June 28, 2025, just 29 days before his scheduled induction ceremony, Dave Parker died from complications related to Parkinson's disease. He would never get to deliver the speech he had been holding on to for so long. He would never get to stand on the stage in Cooperstown and receive the recognition he felt he deserved. The induction ceremony went ahead as planned on July 27, 2025, but it was his son who delivered Parker's speech. It was a bittersweet moment that perfectly captured the tragedy and triumph of Dave Parker's life. He had finally made it to the Hall of Fame, but he couldn't be there to enjoy it. Subscribe to hear more stories about baseball's most controversial figures, and tell us in the comments whether you think Parker's legacy is defined more by his achievements or his mistakes. Dave Parker's story reminds us that talent alone isn't enough. His journey from superstar to addict to Hall of Famer shows that redemption is possible, even if it comes too late. The Cobra finally got his recognition, but the price of his earlier choices followed him until the very end.